I want to answer this question honestly before we go any further, because I think the honest answer is more useful to you than the satisfying one, and this channel has always tried to give you the real picture, rather than the comfortable one. The honest answer is this: in most cases, realizing you truly matter does produce a kind of change in a narcissist, but it's rarely the change people are hoping for when they ask this question, and understanding the actual shape of that change is going to matter enormously if you're currently waiting to see whether this realization will finally transform someone you love. Let's start by naming the assumption baked into the question because it's worth examining directly. The hope underneath, "How will they change when they realize I matter?" usually goes something like this. If a narcissist could just fully grasp how significant someone is, how rare their love or loyalty is, that grasp would function like a switch, flipping them from careless to careful, from extractive to genuinely loving, from someone who takes for granted to someone who finally, permanently appreciates what they have. It's an understandable hope because it would make so much sense if it worked that way. Recognition leading to change is how it works for most people. If you helped a friend understand, clearly and undeniably, how much their carelessness was costing you, most friends would adjust their behavior because the recognition itself would activate genuine care. With a narcissist, recognition and change are much more loosely connected than that, and understanding why requires going back to something we've discussed at length across this whole channel. The recognition itself is real more often than people expect. But what that recognition triggers internally is rarely the straightforward path to better behavior you'd expect from someone with a typical capacity for empathy and follow-through. Let's walk through what actually tends to happen when a narcissist does genuinely register that someone matters more than they'd previously accounted for. The first thing that happens is usually a spike in performed attentiveness, and I want to be precise about calling it performed, not because it's necessarily cynical or calculated in every case, but because it tends to be surface level, visible, and front-loaded rather than structural. This looks like sudden thoughtfulness, increased communication, gestures that feel, for a while, genuinely different from anything offered before. It's real in the sense that it's genuinely motivated by the recognition. They really have registered that you matter, and this is their attempt to act on that registration. But it's performed in the sense that it's organized around demonstrating the change rather than actually becoming a different person underneath the demonstration, which is a distinction that matters enormously for what happens next. The second thing that happens, often running underneath that visible attentiveness, is a specific kind of anxiety that we haven't fully covered on this channel before. Fear of losing something valuable activates a narcissist's threat response system in a way that's genuinely different from fear of losing something replaceable. If you've registered in their mind as rare, as significant, as someone whose absence would represent a real structural loss rather than a routine one, that registration itself produces heightened vigilance. Watching you more closely, reading more into small shifts in your mood or behavior, sometimes becoming more possessive or controlling specifically because the stakes, in their mind, have suddenly gotten much higher. This is worth naming clearly, because it's often mistaken, understandably, for devotion, when it's actually closer to threat management wearing devotion's clothing. The third thing, and this is where the pattern gets genuinely complicated, is that the recognition of your significance often coexists uncomfortably with the same underlying architecture that made the original careless behavior possible in the first place. Recognizing that someone matters doesn't automatically install the capacity for sustained empathy, doesn't automatically resolve the bottomless internal hunger we've discussed in earlier episodes, doesn't automatically undo decades of relating to people as sources of supply rather than as fully separate, equally real human beings. What it does is add a layer of genuine motivation on top of an unchanged underlying structure, which produces, in practice, someone who genuinely wants to treat you better, layered directly over the same mechanisms that made treating you badly feel natural and unremarkable before. This is why the pattern that so often follows this kind of recognition looks like a burst of real improvement, followed by a gradual, sometimes confusing regression back toward familiar behavior. Once the initial motivational spike fades and the underlying architecture, unchanged the whole time, reasserts itself as the path of least resistance. This regression is often genuinely disorienting for the person on the receiving end because the improvement was real enough, sincere enough, motivated by real recognition, that its fading feels like a betrayal of something that had seemed to be working. It's worth understanding that this regression isn't usually evidence that the recognition itself was fake. It's evidence that recognition alone was never actually sufficient to produce the kind of change that requires sustained, difficult, internal work. The same narrow, demanding conditions we discussed in an earlier episode about whether narcissists can genuinely change at all. I want to name something important here, because I think it's the actual heart of today's question. The size of someone's realization that you matter is not the same variable as the size of change their psychology is actually capable of producing in response to that realization. These two things feel like they should be linked. Surely, the more significant the recognition, the more significant the resulting change. But in narcissistic psychology specifically, they're often only loosely correlated, because the bottleneck was never really about the size or sincerity of the recognition. It was always about the underlying capacity for sustained other-oriented growth, which is a separate, much rarer thing, and one that a single moment of clear-eyed recognition, however genuine, doesn't reliably unlock on its own. In Part 2, we're going to look at what genuinely distinguishes the rare cases where recognition does lead to lasting change from the much more common cases where it produces exactly the temporary pattern we've described today, plus what it actually means for you, practically, if you're currently watching someone you love go through this exact recognition right now, how to tell, in real time, which version you're witnessing and what it means for your own choices either way. Stick around, because that part is where this stops being about their psychology and starts being about protecting yours. Let's talk about what genuinely distinguishes the rare cases where recognition leads to lasting change from the far more common pattern we described in Part 1. The first distinguishing factor is whether the change survives the absence of an audience. This is the single most reliable test available to you, and it's worth understanding exactly why it works. Performed attentiveness, the kind we discussed in Part 1, tends to be strongest precisely when it's most visible, around holidays, in front of friends, during moments where the improvement can be witnessed and credited. Genuine structural change looks different. It shows up in the small, unwitnessed moments that don't generate any social credit at all. Whether they're patient with you on an ordinary Tuesday when nobody else is around to notice, whether they follow through on something small they said they'd do with no one keeping score, whether their tone stays consistent when you're mildly inconvenient to them rather than significantly threatening. If the improvement only shows up when it's visible, that's information. If it holds steady in private, unwitnessed moments too, that's a genuinely different, more promising signal. The second distinguishing factor is whether the change is accompanied by genuine curiosity about your experience rather than only concern about the relationship's stability. This distinction is subtle, but important. Someone who's had a real shift in recognizing your worth tends to become more curious about you specifically, your actual internal experience, your history, the things that hurt you and why, asked about with real interest rather than as a means of managing their own anxiety about losing you. Someone caught in the threat response pattern we described in part 1 tends to ask questions oriented around reassurance seeking instead. Are we okay? Do you still love me? Are you going to leave? Which centers their own security rather than genuinely, curiously exploring who you actually are. Both can look, superficially, like increased attention. Only one of them is oriented outward, toward you as a separate person, rather than inward, toward managing their own fear. The third distinguishing factor, and this is the one that takes the longest to observe but is also the most reliable, is how they respond to your own imperfection during this period. This might seem like an odd test, but it's genuinely revealing. Recognition-driven performed attentiveness tends to depend on you continuing to represent something valuable and worth protecting, which means it often becomes conspicuously more fragile the moment you do something ordinary and human. Get irritable, make a mistake, need something inconvenient, fail to reciprocate the sudden burst of attentiveness with equal enthusiasm. If the new version of them collapses or sharply withdraws the first time you're anything less than the idealized, valuable version of yourself that triggered the initial recognition, that's strong evidence the whole shift was organized around protecting an image of you rather than actually sustainably loving the real, imperfect person underneath it. Genuine change holds through your ordinary humanity. Performed change often can't survive it. Now, what does this mean for you? Practically, if you're currently watching someone go through this exact recognition right now, in real time, uncertain which version you're witnessing. The first thing I want to say is that you don't have to resolve this uncertainty immediately, and you're not obligated to make a permanent decision based on the first few weeks of any visible change, whether it's the real kind or the performed kind. Time is actually your best diagnostic tool here, more reliable than any conversation, any promise, any grand gesture, because time is the one thing performed. Attentiveness has a hard time sustaining without an audience, and the one thing genuine change is specifically built to survive. The second thing is to pay closer attention to your own experience during this period than to their behavior in isolation. Notice whether you feel more relaxed around them or whether you feel like you're managing something, walking carefully, hoping the good version holds, bracing slightly for the moment it might not. Genuine change in someone else tends to produce a corresponding sense of ease in you over time, not immediately, but gradually, as evidence accumulates that the improvement is dependable rather than conditional. If instead you notice yourself becoming more vigilant, more careful, more focused on maintaining the good version rather than simply existing normally within it, that vigilance is itself useful information, regardless of what's actually happening on their side. The third thing, and I think this is the most important practical takeaway from this entire two-part episode, is understanding that you are never obligated to wait around indefinitely to find out which version you're witnessing. It's completely reasonable to extend real, good faith patience to someone showing genuine signs of trying, and it's equally reasonable to decide at any point that the uncertainty itself has already cost you enough, regardless of which direction it eventually resolves. Recognition that you matter, even genuine recognition, doesn't create an obligation on your end to stay available while that recognition gets tested against time. Your own life, your own peace, your own boundaries don't need to be suspended indefinitely just because someone finally, belatedly arrived at an accurate understanding of your worth. I want to close with something that I think reframes the entire question we started this two-part episode with. How will they change is, in a very real sense, the wrong question to be asking, or at least an incomplete one, because it puts the entire locus of what happens next inside someone whose track record, by definition, already gave you real information about what to expect. The more useful question, the one I'd encourage you to actually sit with, is this. Regardless of how they change or don't, what do you need to feel safe, valued, and at peace in your own life? That question has an answer you can actually act on immediately, using information you already have, rather than an answer that depends entirely on someone else's uncertain, unfolding psychology, revealing itself on a timeline you don't control and can't predict. Your worth was never actually in question here, even though the entire premise of today's episode centered on someone else finally, belatedly recognizing it. You already knew what you were worth. Whether they eventually catch up to that understanding, and whether that catching up translates into something real and sustained, is genuinely useful information worth watching for. But it was never actually the thing your own sense of value was supposed to depend on in the first place. If you're currently in the middle of watching someone go through this exact recognition, I hope this gave you real, usable tools for telling the difference between the version that lasts and the version that doesn't, and permission to protect your own peace either way, on your own timeline, regardless of which one you turn out to be witnessing. If you want more of this, the real psychology underneath change, recognition, and what it actually takes to tell the difference between the two, subscribe to Mind Horizon. I'll see you in the next one.